Hola amigos and welcome to my NeovimConf spiel on LSP, where I'll rant about some things that I don't really like about it after working in it for a while, both for my day job and my open source activities. And so first, some bluff about myself, given that I need to talk for a while, and so I'm a software engineer in Seattle. I was a Microsoftie in a previous life. I worked on TypeScript, VS Code, and in Visual Studio. And I didn't work with the TypeScript compiler itself, but more on the TypeScript and just in general web development tooling. And so this is why I worked on VS Code and in VS. Relevant to this talk, I've contributed several non-trivial features to Neovim core. And in addition to the stuff that I've included here on the slide, I also just enjoy contributing to my favorite plugins. Oh yes, and I'm also known as a Primeagent meme. But today I didn't come here to talk about myself, but something that you're familiar with if you've ever configured Neovim. And so you might know about LSP because you downloaded a bunch of server configurations from nvim-lspconfig, or you copy-pasted the kickstart on attach function into your init.lua file to set up your key bindings when a new language server is loaded, or you actually know the specification by heart because you wrote an LSP server or an extension that depends on it. And so given that we have all of these different ideas of what LSP is, let's agree on what I'm referring to. And so here's the definition from the Microsoft docs. The language server protocol defines the protocol used between an editor or IDE and the language server that provides language features like autocomplete, go to definition, find all references, etc. And so before I give you my opinionated take on LSP, let me support my authority on the matter. And so I wrote the ESLint integration for Visual Studio, which is basically a C# wrapper around VS Code ESLint, which if you've ever used VS Code, I'm almost certain that you have this extension installed. I added support for LSP features in Visual Studio, like inline hints and rename. And yes, these features already existed in the IDE, but they relied on Roslyn APIs that only worked with C#. And so I created services that would work for any LSP-friendly language in Visual Studio. I wrote the specification for the base protocol, which it was a nice idea. In theory, my goal was to have this protocol that would share the common topics between LSP, DAP, the debug adapter protocol, the build server protocol, and despite the base protocol being part of the LSP specs, it didn't result in anything. I also want to have this disclaimer that this isn't the perspective of an ex-Microsoft employee. This is just me as an open source contributor that's a bit frustrated about LSP. There's nothing secret here. Everything that I'm about to share, you can find it on GitHub, and I'm not going to be sharing like any super secret Microsoft internal stuff. And also this is my opinion. I'm not speaking in behalf of Microsoft or other Neovim core maintainers. And so with the paperwork out of the way, let's start. And so the first thing is that the protocol is ambiguous. Despite its length, the specification is quite vague. When working on the native snippet engine on Neovim, I wrote a parser using the Lua LPEG parsing library, following the grammar defined by LSP, which I included here. However, as I worked on this, I encountered some scenarios which were not documented by the specification, and the different snippet libraries that I was using as a reference supported these unofficial behaviors in different ways. And so here's an example of such ambiguity. Let me pretend that I'm the Primeagent, and I'll just read out loud to you all. And I hid usernames just like to keep people anonymous from this thread. And so I'm not sure what to do with this test, since it tests something that LSP doesn't support in theory. The snippet grammar says that the value of a placeholder node consists of a single node, but the current parser allows it to be multiple nodes. Is that intentional? Should we support this? We only need to support the grammar from the specification. Fine to drop it. On the other hand, could there be any problems with supporting it? Since the goal of this whole snippet thing shouldn't, in my opinion, only be to support the LSP spec, that's the minimal requirement. If we can make it more extensible for free, why not do that? I think it's funny that they say for free, since supporting this, it's non-trivial. No, that is the goal. The basic user interface may be shared and exposed, but the underlying snippet format will only ever be LSP. And LSP for us means the spec and nothing but the spec. And nothing is free. You always pay a cost in maintenance and documentation. I think the spec intended that placeholders could have multiple nodes. For example, the any node to be multiple nodes. The law will parse as any node, but it will have text node and tab subnode. My decision policy was that the implementation should be supported VS Code behavior as much as possible. VS Code allows that. That is different from Neovim's decision policy though, which is if VS Code can stick to their own spec, that's their problem. If the spec can be interpreted as allowing multiple nodes, supporting a permissive reading is fine. That's a different matter. And stick with me, this is the end of the thread. There are many details that are not specified in the LSP specification. For example, LSP does not determine the cursor position after applying text edits. In such cases, I try to check the behavior of VS Code as much as possible. However, I agree that certain features of VS Code should not be implemented. I agree with Fluent Bar. We should follow the LSP spec and not promote a VS Code flavor of it. In case of ambiguities, we can have a larger discussion, but in this case, it is very clear that LSP says that any consists of a single node. There's no reason for that rule not to be written as that. If we need to solve the ambiguity or ensure VS Code sticks to their specification, we should make the change upstream, not make educated guesses per editor. And so as you can see, an ambiguous protocol results in these kind of spicy discussions. Another issue that I have with the protocol is how hard it is to make meaningful contributions to it, especially if you don't work at Microsoft. And so, sure, you can fix a trivial typo, but the process for something like proposing a new feature is quite obscure. Moreover, only a couple of VS Code maintainers have write access to the repo, and there's nothing like a discussion space for going over additions to the protocol. And so, of course, like I'm not asking for something like the Rust Foundation because we already know how that's going, but just kind of like a group of people where not everyone works at Microsoft, where we can all just like discuss on new proposals if it makes sense for the editors that depend on LSP and truly make it what it is by definition, an open source project. Here is an example of one of my attempts at trying to make the guidelines of how to contribute to the LSP more straightforward and just clear in the spec. But let's just say that this PR is still open today. And so, yeah, I don't think that this attempt was successful. Another thing is that LSP, like, let's be real, it's just driven by VS Code extensibility. And so first I should explain what the meta model is, which is basically this JSON object that describes the LSP using JSON. And so the nice thing about the meta model is that it allows editors like Neovim to read this JSON file and generate types for LSP. And so Neovim does this and it generates the Lua types that extensions or that you might even use in your own LSP configuration. And so, as you can see here on the slides, the npm scripts that generate and update the meta model live in VS Code language server node, which is the LSP implementation for VS Code. And so this basically means that in order to update the public APIs, you first need to implement it in VS Code. And so basically 99% of proposals to the protocol end up starting in VS Code. And yes, I just said 99% because Neovim has been able to break the VS Code monopoly and propose and implement a feature that was later officialized in the specs, which is allowing Markdown to be used for diagnostic messages. And so hopefully now, when you have that diagnostic float window, it will have that sweet, beautiful Markdown and three-seater syntax highlighting. Another thing is that I feel that LSP kind of limits what an editor or a server can do regarding feature development. Just implementing LSP is already a pain, both for servers and editors. You need to think about things of how to handle the RPC connection, having handlers, function handlers for every request. If your server might have a different representation of the objects used in the protocol, then you need to deal with how translating those back and forth. And it is just a lot of templates bluff code. There's also the fact that adding a feature that's out of spec, it's a huge hassle. As you can see, adding something to the spec takes forever, and if you want to have a custom message that's not part of the protocol, you need to come up with your own types, come up with your own message, and it might not be worth it. And just implementing LSP isn't enough for IDEs where users want much more than what's documented. And so an example, it is rename. In Visual Studio, when you rename a variable, you get AI generated suggestions. You get the options of things like including comments or strings in the rename. You're able to preview the rename as you change the value in the input field. And on the other side, if you really just want LSP rename, a text box, a text field would be enough. And so in order to really have that experience that's required by an IDE, LSP is simply not enough. And so you will need to always build on top of it and extend it if you really want to have this kind of experience. Another story about this, it is something that happened with Rust Analyzer. And so 4 years ago in 2019, was that 4 years ago? No, 5. So code actions, there was this request of allowing code actions to specify cursor position. And so in Rust, in case that you have never written Rust code, and if so, why? But if you do, I do have experience with Rust, by the way. Anyway, going back, so Rust has this code action that allows you to add a derive macro to a struct or an enum or some other type. And so when you execute that add derive code action, Rust Analyzer wanted to be able to tell the editor to place the cursor inside the parentheses so that the user could continue typing and smoothly fill in the trait that they wanted to derive from. And so this issue was open in 2019, and just until last year in 2023, 4 years later, I closed it. And I mean, the fact that there was this very straightforward request that from MacLad, which is an amazing open source contributor to Rust Analyzer, and it took 4 years to that thing to actually be officialized, shows how difficult and how much of a hassle it is to extend the protocol. In case you're curious, the fix involved snippets, and so code actions, they can say that they will apply a workspace edit, and so the idea was that instead of a workspace edit, they can also indicate that they want to apply a snippet edit. And given that snippets have all of this logic around tab stops and placeholders, you get that cursor control for free. I also have to say that I kind of fell victim to that software engineering bias of, after working on the snippet engine, I thought that snippets would fix everything, and so snippets were of course fresh in my mind, and I thought these to be a nice way to fix it. And so, should we just get rid of LSP? And no. But let's be aware of the things that are wrong with it, right? I think that's a good first step. And listen, I would be a hypocrite if I end this presentation saying that I don't love the protocol, because I do. Thanks to the standard language spec, we can achieve the kind of editing experience that makes VS Code users join the dark side. It also makes the work much easier for LSP servers when they want to support a new feature, because they can focus on the language server beats without focusing on UI that differs on every editor. And so, for example, you can imagine if you have your LSP server and you want to be able to provide completions. Imagine if you had to have similar logic to what Nvim-CMP does, of figuring out how to translate a completion item to a completion item in Neovim, creating the window for the completion, the sorting, and all of this logic that it is different in every editor, and it would make it like a huge pain, and it would really place a block between the feature parity that editors have. And finally, I just don't know what we should be doing instead. And before burning something, I think we should know what an alternative should be. And so, given that I don't have one, I think that for now we can focus on seeing how we can improve the current situation. And so, what you can do when something is funky with one of your LSP servers, say that when you open Neovim and I don't know, you execute a certain code action, you get this angry red error message saying like unexpected null thing or something like that. Look up the implementation of the server, compare it to the respective notification or requests in the LSP spec, and see if the server is doing that maybe it shouldn't do. If it's something about returning nil, the LSP is very clear about when nil is an acceptable response. And so make that investigation. Don't immediately blame Neovim, and in particular, don't just say like, oh, it works in VS Code, because like, no, please don't. And after this investigation, you will probably know enough and you will be able to explicitly pinpoint where the error is and what the fix should be. And at that point, just be a good citizen, and you can contribute the fix. Usually these are very straightforward and very appreciated. And definitely don't just replicate hacks. And so sometimes stuff will just work in VS Code because VS Code might have a hack for a certain LSP server. Neovim won't do that. In Neovim, we don't support misbehaving servers, and so don't just copy paste a hack that you saw in VS Code, because VS Code is not the standard. We follow the LSP, and so don't do that. And I'm not that revolutionary to be the first one not to talk nicely about LSP. If you enjoyed this presentation, I would suggest that you take a look at these couple of blog posts. The first one, it's also from MacLad, a Rust analyzer legend. LSP could have been better. And then there's a newer one, LSP the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, from a core maintainer of LSP libraries in Haskell. So those would be great reads. And that's all. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening.